When they found her, 2 weeks later, and 7 miles from her own boat, she had no clothes on, and there was a piece of the boat driven into the sole of her shoe, not lying beside it, embedded in it. The metal knob that clamps the navigation unit to the instrument panel, forced through the rubber of a torn running shoe with enough violence to bury it there. Her boat had been found long before she was. Drifting in rough water in the middle of Lake Huron, far off the course, she had radioed to her own parents, with the engine idling in neutral and the radio still playing. Clothes lying on the deck, money in the wallet, untouched, no damage to the hull, nothing broken, nothing burned, nothing taken, and nobody on board. The detective who came aboard that vessel was asked later, on national television, whether he had found any sign of a struggle, any blood, anything at all. He used one word for all 3 questions: nothing. 2 people had left the dock on that boat. Both were lawyers. One of them was the daughter of a Coast Guard officer who had trained her himself, and every person who knew her described her as the most careful boater they had ever been on the water with. She came back naked, 7 miles away, with the boat inside her shoe. The man has never been found at all. This is Echo 7. 15 cases tonight, and every one of them is a boat that came back without the people who were on it. Some were drifting. Some were still under power. 2 of them were running in circles on the water with nobody at the wheel. One crossed an entire Great Lake by itself and beached on the far shore in another country. The vessels are intact. The gear is where it was left. In several of these files, the last meal is still sitting there. None of them gets explained here, because in most of these cases nobody can, and in the ones where somebody tried, the explanation raised more questions than it settled. Start with the boat that was still playing music. August of 2005. Lana Stempien and Chuck Rutherford lived together in Grosse Pointe Farms, outside Detroit. They were both attorneys. They were, by every account of everybody who knew them, a couple with money and a good life, and no trouble in it that anybody could name. Understand the water they were on, because Lake Huron is not a lake in the sense most people use the word. It is 23,000 square miles. It is the 2nd largest of the Great Lakes by surface area, and it holds depths past 750 feet. Stand in the middle of it, and there is no land in any direction. It has its own weather. It builds a short, steep chop that punishes small boats, and it has swallowed an estimated 1,000 vessels since Europeans started writing things down. The route they were taking is the one everybody takes. Hug the Michigan shoreline north, keep land on your left, and cross the straits at the top. It is the safe route. It exists precisely so that a recreational boat is never far from shelter. They set out from a dock on the Belle River in Ontario on the 10th of August, heading north up the Lake Huron shoreline, planning to cross the Straits of Mackinac and spend a few days on Mackinac Island. Stempien had grown up on that water. Her father was a retired Coast Guard officer, and he had trained her himself. They were last seen alive at 1:45 in the afternoon on the 11th, motoring into brisk winds after taking on fuel at a dock at Presque Isle. About an hour after that, Stempien called her parents from the boat and told them they were near Rogers City and expected to dock at Mackinac Island in roughly 2 hours. She said she would call again when they arrived. She never called. The vessel was called the Sea's Life, and she was found tossing about in open water, significantly off the course she had described, with the motor idling in neutral and the radio on. The detective from the Michigan State Police who took the case was asked directly, on national television, what he had found aboard. Was there anything indicating foul play? Nothing. Any signs of a struggle? Nothing. Any obvious blood? Nothing. Money was in the wallet. Clothes were lying on the deck. There was nothing unusual. Nothing unusual on a boat with no people on it, in the middle of a Great Lake. 2 weeks later, Lana Stempien came ashore in Hammond Bay, about 7 miles from where the vessel had been found. She was nude, and the lake gave nothing else back. No second body, no personal effects, no clothing beyond what was already lying on the deck. Lake Huron is 23,000 square miles of cold fresh water with depths past 700 feet, and cold fresh water is the worst environment in North America for the recovery of a person, because bodies in it do not always rise. Bacterial gas production, which is the mechanism that brings a body to the surface, slows to almost nothing below a certain temperature. Chuck Rutherford was never recovered. Not that month, not that year, not in the 20 years since. A maritime expert who spent a quarter of a century reconstructing boating disappearances said flatly that he would have expected the second body to surface at around the same time and in the same general area as the first. Now, here are the details that keep this case out of the ordinary column, and I want you to hold all of them at once. The first is the watch. Stempian owned an Omega that was not waterproof, and she had recently paid $300 to have it serviced. According to the people who knew her habits, she had a fixed routine before ever going into the water. She would slide her jewelry onto the watch band, unclip the watch, and fasten it to the steering wheel. Every time, without exception. She was wearing it when she was found. The second is the shoe, and it is worth returning to now that you have the rest of the file, rather than leaving it as an opening image. Consider what has to happen for a piece of hardware to end up inside the sole of a shoe. That knob is a small threaded fitting on the instrument panel, at chest height, inside the cabin. A person standing on it would not embed it. A person falling on it might. A person being pressed onto it, or striking it at speed, or the shoe being driven down onto it by a force greater than a body weight would. The shoe was torn. The knob was in the rubber. The panel it belongs to was in the cabin, and she was in the lake. The third is the timestamp. That positioning unit had been switched on at 22 minutes past 1 in the morning, on the same night, hours after her last phone call, and hours before anybody found the boat. Somebody turned the navigation on in the middle of the night, in the middle of Lake Huron, on a vessel that was already far from where it should have been. A fourth thing sits underneath that timestamp. She had told her parents at about 1:45 in the afternoon that they were near Rogers City and would dock in roughly 2 hours. Rogers City is on the Michigan shore. Mackinac Island is north and west of it. That is a defined stretch of water with a defined destination, and the Sea's life was found well outside it. A boat that loses its crew doesn't steer. It goes where the wind and the water put it, and on a bad night that can be tens of miles, so the position she was found in proves nothing on its own. But a drifting boat does not switch on its own navigation at 22 minutes past 1 in the morning. Somebody was standing at that panel, in the dark, hours after the last phone call, on a vessel that had already left its route. The Michigan State Police detective who carried that file worked it until he retired. The case is now in the missing persons drawer. The attorney representing Stempian's family said one thing about the picture that has stayed with me since I read it. He was describing what the state of that boat suggested to him, and his answer was that it looked like the work of somebody who did not want anybody to know where that boat had been. That is one man's reading, and it is not a finding, and nobody has ever proven any part of it. 14 more of these are coming, and I would ask you to keep a running tally of how many times somebody with a badge or a license uses the word nothing. 2 decades have passed since that boat was towed in. The detective retired. The family's attorney is on the record with his reading, and nobody has ever tested it in a courtroom because there has never been anything to test. What remains is an evidence inventory that reads like a list of things that should not go together. A running engine, a playing radio, folded clothing, an untouched wallet, a torn shoe with a piece of the instrument panel in it, a non-waterproof watch on the wrist of a woman who always took it off, and a navigation unit that somebody switched on in the small hours of that night. Any one of those has an innocent explanation. Every one of them. What nobody can account for is the set. Before the next one, a word about what the first case establishes, because it sets the rules for everything after it. The Sea's life was not damaged. That is the finding that removes the easy explanation before you have even started. A boat that has been overwhelmed by weather shows it. There is water below. There are things off their mountings. There is damage where the sea came aboard. A boat that has hit something shows that too. A boat that has burned, or flooded, or broached tells you within seconds of stepping aboard. That vessel showed a running engine, a playing radio, clothing on the deck, and an untouched wallet, which means whatever happened aboard the Sea's life happened to the people and not to the boat. Hold that distinction, because it is the line that separates tonight's 15 cases from the ordinary tragedy of the water. A capsize, a swamping, a fire, a collision. Those produce wreckage, debris fields, and bodies within a predictable radius. Every one of them is a boating accident, and every one of them is explicable. An intact hull with an empty deck is not a boating accident. It is a boat that carried on being a boat while the people on it stopped being aboard. 2021, and a bay on the western side of an island in the United States Virgin Islands. Sarm Heslop was 41 years old. She was British, from Southampton, and she had been a flight attendant before deciding she wanted a different kind of life. She met a man through a dating app, and by the beginning of that year she was living aboard his 47-foot catamaran in the Caribbean, working as the chef on a boat that took private charters. She had been aboard for about 2 weeks. The bay she was moored in is on the western side of St. John, within sight of the shore. This is not a boat at sea. A catamaran on a mooring in that bay is a few hundred yards from land. In water you could swim in daylight, surrounded by other vessels and overlooked by houses. That geography is the whole problem with the case, and it is why it has never gone quiet. On the evening of the 7th of March, the two of them went ashore for dinner. The island was under a curfew at the time. They came back to the catamaran, which was moored in the bay. At around 2:30 in the morning, her partner called the police and said she was gone. He told officers that he had woken up because the anchor alarm had gone off. An anchor alarm is a simple thing. It sounds when the boat moves outside a set radius, meaning the anchor has dragged or the vessel has shifted. He said he woke to that alarm, and she was not on the boat. A gap in that night has never been closed, and it is measured in hours. The call to the local police came at about 2:30 in the morning. Officers advised him to contact the Coast Guard instead, which is standard for a vessel at anchor in territorial water. Nobody reached the Coast Guard until 11:45 in the morning. 9 hours and change between the alarm going off and the agency with the boats, aircraft, and search capability being told that a woman was missing off a moored catamaran. 9 hours is not a technicality on water. It is the difference between a search area you can draw and a search area the size of a sea. Her phone was aboard. Her wallet was aboard. Her passport was aboard. Everything a person needs to exist anywhere on the planet was sitting on that catamaran, and she was not. The search that followed covered the coastline and the water. Divers went in. Dogs worked the shore. Nothing was found. Not a body, not an item of clothing, not a trace. And here is the fact about this case that outsiders always assume must be wrong when they first hear it, because it doesn't sound possible. The boat was never searched. Police stated publicly that permission to search the catamaran was declined, and that the man aboard exercised his right to remain silent. Detectives said more than a year later that they had been unable to confirm whether Heslop had even been on the vessel that night. Let that sit for a second. 5 years on, the official position is not that they know what happened aboard. It is that they cannot confirm she was aboard. An anchor alarm deserves a sentence of its own because most people have never heard of one, and it is the only piece of technology in this case. You set it by telling the instrument where the boat is and how far it is allowed to move. If the vessel swings outside that circle, the alarm sounds. It exists for one reason: to wake you up if the anchor drags and the boat starts going somewhere. So the account given is that a machine designed to detect the movement of the boat is what woke him, and that when he woke, the person was gone. it does not detect a person going into the water. It cannot. It is watching the position of the hull. What happened next was that the people who loved her took over the machinery of the case themselves. Her friends in the United Kingdom, working with a local Crime Stoppers group, raised money and offered a reward of up to $10,000 and said that even the smallest and apparently irrelevant detail might matter. In the summer of the following year, the family appointed a former commander of homicide and serious crime at the Metropolitan Police in London as their official liaison, because they had concluded they needed somebody who had run murder investigations to deal with the process on their behalf. Her parents flew to the island on the first anniversary, accompanied by a consul, to piece together their daughter's last known movements themselves. The BBC eventually made a documentary series about it. The case has been on American network television more than once. A year in, their public statement was that they still had only the same handful of facts about what happened that night. Nobody has been charged with anything, and I want to be clear about that, because the internet is not clear about it. Her partner has denied any involvement. No court has found otherwise. What exists is a set of facts with a hole in the middle, a woman on a boat at anchor, an alarm in the night, a phone and a passport left behind, a vessel that was never examined, and an ocean that gave back nothing at all. If you are the kind of person who wants the record rather than the verdict, that is what this channel does. And subscribing takes a second. Georgia, and a boat that was doing something no unoccupied boat should be able to do. Before the case itself, understand why circling is the detail that makes people who work on water sit up. An outboard motor steers by, pivoting the engine itself. Let go of the tiller or the wheel with the throttle open, and the motor does not stay straight. It settles into whatever angle the water pressure and the linkage give it, and the boat turns, and it keeps turning, and it will keep turning until the fuel runs out. That is exactly what a boat does when the person operating it stops operating it and does not fall against anything on the way out. So a boat circling under power is not a mystery in mechanical terms. It is the signature of an unoccupied helm. What it tells you is the one thing you want to know and cannot have. It tells you that somebody went off that boat while it was running, and it tells you absolutely nothing about when. Lake Oconee sits about 75 miles southeast of Atlanta, in a part of the state people call the Lake Country. On the 8th of February, a man named Gary Jones and his fiancée, Joycelyn Nicole Wilson, drove down from Atlanta to celebrate his 50th birthday. He was a track and field coach at a school in Atlanta. She was a mathematics professor who had been teaching at Spelman College since 2007. They had a small boat, an 11-foot Sun Dolphin, which is about as modest as a motorboat gets. Wilson drove the truck with the trailer to the lodge, parked, and checked them in. Jones brought the boat around by water, and they loaded a few things aboard. It was about 3:30 in the afternoon. Look at that vessel for a second, because the boat is the case here. A Sun Dolphin of that size is a molded plastic hull, light enough for one person to drag up a ramp, with a small outboard hung off the back and a couple of bench seats. It has no cabin, no rail worth the name, and freeboard measured in inches. It is a pond boat. It is what you buy to take a child fishing off a dock. 2 adults, a motor, and a fuel tank on 11 feet of molded plastic. At a few minutes past 5, somebody on the lake called 911. They reported a small boat circling on the water with its engine running. There was nobody in it. The sheriff of Putnam County said something in the days that followed that I keep going back to. He said an entire day had passed before he learned that the boat had actually been under power and running at the time it was found. And then he added 5 words, and just some peculiarities about all of it. Peculiarities from a sitting sheriff about a case in his own county. It was February. The water on that lake in February sits in the low 50s at best, which is cold enough to take the strength out of an adult's arms inside 15 minutes, and cold enough to stop a heart inside an hour. The distance a person can swim in that water is measured in dozens of yards, not hundreds. Wilson was found the next day, floating on Lake Oconee. Game wardens recovered her. Jones has not been found. The sheriff did the arithmetic in public, taking the weight of both of them from their driver's licenses, plus the motor and the fuel tank. There was something in the region of 400 pounds on an 11-foot boat. He calculated how long it would have taken that motor, with that load, to reach the place where the boat was circling. 90 minutes, roughly, from where they set off to where the boat was found empty. 90 minutes is a very long time on a lake in February. Volunteers have been out on that lake week after week, regardless of what the official position is, and one detail from those weeks has stayed with me more than any of the statements. One of them pulled a piece of molded beige plastic out of the water and was convinced it was a piece of the boat. The sheriff had to explain, as gently as he could, that what the man was holding was a tray out of somebody's tackle box. That is what a search on a lake looks like from the inside. People who have never met the missing man, out in February, on cold water, fishing debris out of the surface and hoping it means something. A local fisherman who has lived on that lake most of his life has been helping every time he is out on the water. He met people from the school where the missing man coached. That is the shape it takes. A county quietly absorbing a case that nobody can close. What was actually on that boat when they found it was a large chocolate chip cookie decorated with frosting, a few bananas, and some water. A birthday cookie, going in circles, 4 boats in, and if you are still with me, you already know this channel does not hand you an ending that the file does not contain. Subscribing is what keeps that possible. A last thing about Lake Oconee before we go, and it is about what a sheriff has to do with a case like this. He has stated publicly that all the physical evidence, the witnesses, and everything else in his possession indicates drowning, and that searching the lake is therefore the proper use of his resources. He also said he did not expect the man to be found until the body surfaced, and he put that at 14 to 20 days after the incident. This is a professional making a resource decision correctly, on the information available, in cold water, with a small department. And it sits directly alongside his other statement, the one about learning a full day later that the boat had been under power, and the peculiarities about all of it. Both of those are true at once. The evidence indicates drowning. The circumstances contain things that do not sit right. A sheriff can hold both and still have to decide where to send his boats on a Tuesday. That tension is in every file tonight, and it is not corruption or laziness. It is what it looks like when an agency has to act on a scene that cannot be read. Florida, and the case that made me build tonight's episode in this order, because it is the only one where the water eventually gave a man back, and the answer got worse. Patrick Mullins liked to fish the Braden River on the Gulf Coast south of Tampa. He was an excellent mechanic, particularly with engines, and the people who knew him said he was the sort of man who would stop for a stranger with a dead motor. His boat was a stump knocker, which is a small shallow water skiff built for exactly the kind of fishing he did. It was found at sea, in Tampa Bay, with nobody aboard. Nobody has ever been able to explain how it got there. Read that carefully, because it is doing something specific. This was not a boat found drifting where a boat might drift. A photograph taken from a Coast Guard vessel pulled up alongside it shows the skiff sitting on open water with no one on it. And the plain statement attached to that image is that nobody knows how or when that boat reached Tampa Bay without him in it. The Braden River is a small tidal river on the Gulf Coast, the kind of water where you can see both banks and where everybody on it recognizes everybody else's boat. It runs down into the Manatee River and out into Tampa Bay. So, that is a route. A skiff does not accidentally arrive in open bay water from a small tidal river without going down the whole of that system, past marinas, past houses, past other boats. 9 days later, Patrick Mullins was found floating, miles from where the skiff had been recovered. He was bound to a boat anchor from the waist down. He had a shotgun wound to the head. Investigators initially considered that he had taken his own life. Then the picture stopped supporting it. He was happily married. There were no financial problems. There was no history of depression, and the forensics would not cooperate, for two reasons that have never been resolved. There was no blood in the boat, and the shotgun was never found. A man cannot shoot himself in the head with a long gun aboard a small open skiff and leave no blood on any surface of it. And a weapon that goes into the water with a body does not usually travel separately from it. The anchor itself is the part nobody talks about enough. A boat anchor is not a weight you pick up and carry. On a skiff that size, it is a metal object with flukes designed to bite into a bottom, attached to a rode. To bind a man to one from the waist down requires the anchor, the line, the man, and time. And it requires all of that to happen somewhere. It did not happen in the boat. There was none of it in the boat. Then, after the skiff had already been recovered and examined, new smudges of unidentified red paint were discovered on it. Red paint that was not there before, on a boat in police custody, of a color and origin nobody has ever matched to anything. The question that has followed that detail for years is whether the paint transferred from another vessel that came alongside his, out on the water, before he died. The questions that have followed that file for years are the ones that a reasonable person arrives at within about a minute of hearing the facts, and they have never been answered. What sequence of events puts a man in the water, bound to his own anchor with a shotgun wound, and leaves his boat clean? Whether he came across something on the river that he was not meant to see, whether the red paint arrived from another hull that came alongside his out on the water. Those are not my theories. They are the open questions attached to the case in the public record, and the reason they are open is that nobody has been able to close them. Nearly a decade on, the manner of death in the Patrick Mullins file is still officially classified as undetermined. Hold on to that word tonight, and you are going to hear it more than once. Undetermined is not a shrug. It is a medical examiner stating in writing that the physical evidence available fits more than one story, and refusing to choose between them. Now go back nearly as far as this channel goes, to a marina in Washington State, and a case so thin that the detective who has it calls it the smallest file he owns. The 14th of April, 1971. Around 9:30 at night, 7 college students left a marina in Tacoma aboard a 22-foot Catalina sailboat. 7. They were never seen again. 7 students on a 22-foot sailboat is worth pausing on before anything else. 22 feet is a small day sailor. It is a hull with a cockpit and a cramped cabin, designed for 2 adults comfortably and 4 at a squeeze. 7 adults aboard one is a crowd standing shoulder to shoulder, and it is a great deal of weight high up in a boat that stays upright by ballast and geometry. They left at 9:30 at night in April. April in Puget Sound is cold water. Surface temperatures in that month run in the high 40s, which is a range in which an unprotected adult has minutes of useful function, and under an hour before the cold itself becomes fatal. What followed was one of the largest maritime searches in the history of Puget Sound. It ran for 6 days. The Coast Guard called it off on the evening of the 20th of April. It found no wreckage, no bodies, no debris. Nothing floated up. Nothing washed ashore. 7 people and a sailboat left a marina in a busy, enclosed, heavily used American waterway, and the water closed over the whole thing without leaving a cushion, a life ring, a piece of hull, or a shoe. And Puget Sound is not the open ocean. It is an inland sea, enclosed, hemmed by land on both sides, with towns and ferry routes and shipping lanes running through it and shoreline within sight from almost anywhere on it. Things that go into that water tend to come ashore. Because there is shore in every direction, nothing came ashore. Then, in December of 1979, 8 years later, a fishing vessel dragging nets in Colvos Passage west of Vashon Island brought something up. At around 50 fathoms, roughly 300 feet down, the nets briefly raised what appeared to be a small sailboat. It slipped back into the water before it could be recovered. Consider what that means mechanically. A commercial fishing net, dragging along the bottom at around 300 feet, took the weight of an object large enough for the crew to identify by shape as a small sailboat, lifted it far enough to see, and then lost it. Nets fail that way. A net is fabric and line, and an object that heavy either tears through it or slides out as the angle changes. But the crew reported what they saw, and somebody wrote it down. And 8 years after 7 students vanished with a 22-foot sailboat, a net briefly raised a small sailboat off the bottom of Colvos Passage. In January of 1980, the United States Navy sent a minesweeper to run a sonar survey of that area. It found nothing. Consider what 1971 means for the evidence, too. No mobile phones, no emergency beacons, no satellite tracking on a recreational sailboat, because none of that existed. No mandatory float plan filed with anybody. A 22-foot boat leaving a marina at 9:30 at night in April of that year left no electronic trace of any kind, anywhere, and the only record that it went out at all is that 7 people did not come back. The case is still listed as active by the Tacoma Police Department, and the detective in the cold case unit who holds it has described it as the thinnest file in a collection of 164 unsolved cases, some of which date back to 1927. The majority of the original investigation was carried out by the Coast Guard, and those records have never been located. Every parent of every one of those 7 students is now dead. The detective was asked whether it would ever be solved, and his answer was about starting points. Peeling a sticker off an old sticker, he said, "You have to have a place to begin. Get the right point, and the whole thing comes away. There is no starting point. That is the case. 7 names, 1 boat, no debris, and a file thin enough to hold in one hand. If a case like that is worth an hour of your evening, subscribe, because there are more of them than anybody has counted." A final note on the 1971 file before we come forward, because of what it says about how these cases decay. The majority of the original investigation was conducted by the Coast Guard, and those records have never been located, not sealed, not restricted, not lost in a fire that somebody can point to, simply not findable, decades later, by the detective who now holds the case. What sits in the Tacoma Police Department binder is a few statements from the officers who took the initial missing persons report, and that is the whole of it. The detective who has that binder has said outright that he does not know what happened to those students, where it happened, where the boat is, or any information at all. He also said something about how a case like that would have to be broken, and it is the most honest description of cold case work I have heard. "It is like taking a sticker off an old sticker," he said. "You have to have a starting point. You start peeling at one place, and if you grab the right point, the whole thing comes away. There is no place to start peeling. That is the case, and every parent who could have supplied one is dead." Labor Day, 2019. Lake Washington, which runs along the eastern edge of Seattle and is crossed by floating bridges carrying tens of thousands of cars a day. Vanna Nguyen was 33. She and James Lee took a speedboat out on the holiday. At around 10:30 at night, Mercer Island police found the boat drifting near the south end of the island. Music was playing on it. There were signs that people had been aboard. Officers described it that way in plain language. Signs people were aboard. And the vessel empty. Their truck and the trailer that had carried the boat to the water were still sitting in the park in Renton, where they had launched. That detail repeats through tonight, and it is worth naming. The van at the ramp, the truck at the park. It turns up in Wisconsin with a van and a trailer at a county park, and here with a truck and trailer in Renton, and it turns up in almost every one of these files. The most ordinary object in the case is doing something specific. It is the proof that the trip was real, that it began where everybody thinks it began, and that nobody drove away afterwards. It is also the reason these searches start where they start. A vehicle at a launch anchors the whole investigation to a point on land, and the boat by then is somewhere else entirely. Lake Washington is worth a sentence because of what surrounds it. It is inside a metropolitan area of 4 million people. 2 floating bridges cross it. There are marinas, waterfront homes, a university, and a shoreline lit up in every direction. On a holiday night in September, there are boats on it everywhere. They were found at 10:30 at night, drifting near the south end of the island, in the middle of one of the most populated and observed bodies of water in the western United States. The Coast Guard searched and then suspended the search. Family and friends kept going after the agencies stopped. 3 boats tonight have now been found with the sound still on. Radio playing on Lake Huron, music playing on Lake Washington, and a third one we have not reached yet. I have no idea what to do with that, and pretending it means something would be dishonest. But it keeps happening, and every time it does, it means the same practical thing. Whatever happened aboard, it happened fast enough that nobody reached over and turned the music off. Several of tonight's 15 involve somebody alone on the water, and it is worth naming what that changes. 2 people aboard means there is a witness. Whatever happens to one of them, the other one is there. And if both go, the fact that both went is itself information. It means something happened that took 2 people at once, or it means one went in and the other went after them, which is one of the most common and most lethal sequences on water. A boat with 1 person aboard has no witness at all. It has a hull, and whatever the hull was doing when somebody found it. That distinction runs right through tonight. 2 on the cabin cruiser in Lake Huron, 2 on the speedboat in Lake Washington, 2 on the Sun Dolphin in Georgia, 1 in a kayak in Wisconsin, 1 in a kayak in the Gulf, 1 on a skiff on the Braden River, 1 on a fishing boat on Lake Erie. The cases with 2 people produce more questions. The cases with 1 person produce fewer facts. Neither produces an answer. Wisconsin, in the November dark. And if these are landing for you, that is the whole of what this channel does, and subscribing is the only thing that decides whether it keeps doing it. Lake Butte des Morts, near the town of Omro in Winnebago County. Michael Iriart was 41. On a Sunday afternoon, he put a kayak into Samers Bay to fish near Terrell's Island. He was last seen at about 3 in the afternoon. His family called the sheriff's office at 20 to 6 when he did not come home. The search that night involved the sheriff's office, the police and fire departments, a state conservation warden and other responders, with drones covering the bay, the island, and the brook that feeds it. It was suspended late that night when, in the language of the sheriff's office, all available search efforts were exhausted or proven ineffective. They resumed at first light with boats, a plane, and ground teams walking the coastline. Just before 1:30 in the afternoon, they found the kayak. They did not find him. The search language in that file is worth reading closely too. The sheriff's office suspended the first night when, in their own words, all available search efforts were exhausted or proven ineffective. Proven ineffective. On a shallow lake in November, hours after a man failed to come home from an afternoon of fishing, with drones in the air. Lake Butte des Morts is a shallow, wide lake on the Fox River system, and shallow is the word to hold. Much of it is under 10 feet. It is the kind of water where a person standing on the bottom in many places would have their head above the surface, and it is the kind of water where a search with sonar and drones ought to work. He had been wearing a blue and gray life jacket. That detail was in the description the sheriff's office released, because it was what he had on when he was last seen. A life jacket is the entire point of a life jacket. A person wearing one floats, whether they are conscious or not, and floating is what makes a body findable in the first 24 hours. That is the design. The kayak came back. The man in the life jacket did not. A last note on Wisconsin before the Gulf, and it concerns the shape of the search rather than the man. Drones covered the bay, the island, and the brook that feeds it, on the night he failed to come home. Boats and a plane went out at first light. Ground teams walked the coastline on foot. That is a complete search of a small, shallow, enclosed piece of water by every method available, run within 24 hours of the last sighting, in the best possible conditions for finding somebody. It produced the kayak, which is the pattern in 14 of tonight's 15, and it is the reason the episode is called what it is. The equipment always comes back. In several of these cases, it comes back on the first pass, within hours, exactly where the model said it would be. The equipment is findable, the person is not, and the two are separated by a gap in time that nobody in any of these files has ever been able to measure. Florida again, and a boat so small, it barely qualifies. On the 1st of May, a witness on the water off Bonita Beach, on the Gulf Coast south of Fort Myers, called the sheriff's office to report an abandoned kayak floating about 3 miles offshore. 3 miles out, in the Gulf of Mexico, alone. Deputies reached it and found documents inside belonging to a man named Kenneth Humiston. He was 77 years old and lived in Naples, about 14 miles down the coast. The Marine Unit of one county, the Sheriff's Office of the next county, and the United States Coast Guard searched the area immediately, including a bay and a pass. Now look at the object. A sit-on-top kayak is a piece of molded plastic about 10 feet long with no cabin, no keel, no engine, and no shelter. It holds a course only because a human being with a paddle makes it, and it presents almost nothing for the wind to push against. 3 miles offshore in the Gulf puts it beyond the sight of anybody on the beach, in water where the afternoon sea breeze builds every day of the year. That is a long way to paddle for a man of any age, and it is a long way to be in a plastic boat with nothing over your head if the wind comes up. And that is the part nobody can resolve. A kayak found 3 miles out either paddled 3 miles out or drifted there. Those are very different stories, and the object cannot tell you which one it is. Before the next run of cases, here is what actually happens to a person who goes into water off a boat, because almost everything the public believes about it comes from film, and it is wrong in the direction that matters. The danger is not drowning in the sense of being unable to swim. The danger arrives in 3 stages, and the first one is the killer. Stage 1 is cold shock, and it starts within seconds of immersion. Sudden cold water triggers an involuntary gasp, followed by a period of uncontrollable hyperventilation lasting a minute or 2. If the face is under when the gasp happens, water goes into the lungs immediately. There is no decision involved, and no amount of experience prevents it. A person who has been on boats their whole life gasps exactly as hard as a person who has never seen water. Stage 2 is swim failure, and it takes hold within about 10 to 15 minutes. The body shunts blood away from the limbs to protect the core, and hands and forearms stop working properly. Grip goes first. A person in that state can be fully conscious, fully aware, 3 body lengths from a boat, and physically unable to close a hand around the gunnel. Stage 3 is hypothermia proper, and it is the slowest. In water in the 50s, it can take an hour or more, which produces the fact that governs every case tonight. Most people who die from going into cold water do not die of the cold. They die in the first minute, or they die at the 10-minute mark with the boat still in sight, and the boat at that point is still moving. One piece of machinery is worth installing before the next run of cases because it explains why so many of these end the way they do. When somebody goes into the water from a vessel, the search that follows is not a hunt. It is a drift model. Planners take a last known position, feed in wind speed, surface current, wave state, and the drift characteristics of what they are looking for, and produce a probability map that expands and moves with the hours. Everything in that model depends on the last known position being correct. And in almost every case tonight, the last known position is the place a boat was found, which is not where anybody went into the water. It is where the hull stopped. The model needs a second thing, and it is the one that decides survival. A person in the water is drifting too, and drifting differently from the boat, because a body sits low with almost no surface for the wind to push, while a hull sits high and gets shoved along. Within an hour, those 2 objects are on separate trajectories. Within a night, they can be miles apart. which is why the boat is almost always what gets found. It is bigger, it is higher, it is painted, it carries lights and reflective surfaces, and it is designed by human beings to be visible on water. The person is the opposite of all of those things. Before those, one number that frames the rest of the episode. The Coast Guard responds to something in the order of 16,000 search and rescue cases in American waters in a typical year. That figure covers everything: engine failures, medical emergencies, overdue vessels, groundings, people in the water, boats on fire. A fraction of those are boats found with nobody on them. Nobody publishes that fraction as a standing figure. There is no annual count of unoccupied vessel recoveries in the United States, no database that logs them as a category, and no requirement that a vessel found empty be connected to a missing persons report at all, which is why the 4 cases I am about to give you took a matter of minutes to find, and would take a month to trace to an outcome. Now let me put 4 short ones next to each other, because the point of them is not any single case. It is the frequency. Lake Erie, this July. And these next 4 are the ones that changed how I think about the whole subject. So stay with me and subscribe if you have not. The Coast Guard reported that a 19-foot boat had been found empty on the Canadian side, at Long Point, rigged for fishing. The trolling motor was still running. American and Canadian Coast Guard crews and local agencies searched through the night and into the following day, working the water between Prestre Isle and Long Point. The official statement from the Coast Guard was that they did not know what had happened to the man on board. This is the second boat tonight found under power with nobody at the controls, and it happened 5 weeks ago. Northern Wisconsin, in May. A caller on the Lac du Flambeau reservation reported a runaway boat on the lake. It was circling. There was nobody in it. A multi-agency search went out the same day. Third boat under power. Third empty seat, the Washington coast. A large sailboat washed ashore on the Long Beach Peninsula, and police were notified just before 7 in the morning. Officers and lifeguards found it abandoned, with no sign of any crew anywhere around it. The boat was towed off the beach. Then the neighbors told the news something the police statement had not included. The boat had already been there for several days. A large sailboat, hard aground on an American beach in daylight, on a peninsula where people walk dogs and drive on the sand. And for several days, every person who saw it made the same private calculation. Somebody else has dealt with this. It is a wreck. It is abandoned. It is not my business. When somebody finally called, it was unclear who owned it and unclear how or when it had arrived. Whoever had been on it had those days. And on the 11th of December, in Mukilteo, Washington, a vessel with no lights and no crew drifted straight through a working state ferry terminal at night. There is video of it. A ferry's navigation spotlights swing onto the empty boat as it passes silently through the terminal, and the person filming can be heard saying 2 words: "What in the world?" The ferry service put out a statement afterwards about the danger of unlit vessels, because a crewless boat in a ferry lane is a collision waiting to happen. The boat coasted out into open water and kept going. I have not been able to find a follow-up on that one. It drifted through the frame and out of the record. Those 4 have a shape worth naming before moving on, and the shape is not in the vessels. It is in the record. For the Lake Erie boat, the public information is a Coast Guard statement admitting they cannot account for the man who was on it. For the Wisconsin reservation, it is a report of a runaway boat and a multi-agency search. For the sailboat on the Washington coast, it is a line saying it was unclear who owned it and how or when it arrived. For the ferry terminal, it is a video and a safety advisory about unlit vessels. That is the entirety of what exists in public for 4 separate events in which an American boat was found with nobody on it. No names in 3 of the 4. No outcomes in any of them. No follow-up story a week later saying what happened, because there is no reporter assigned to find out, and no agency obliged to say. These are not cold cases. A cold case has a file. These are events that occurred, were logged, and dissolved. 4 cases in a few minutes from 4 different bodies of water, and none of them made national news, and there is nothing exceptional about any of them from the point of view of the agencies involved. Empty boats are a routine call. Stop on that, because it is the actual finding of tonight's episode. And it was not the finding I expected when I started. A sheriff in Georgia said it out loud to a reporter. He said that the average person watching a disappearance unfold on his lake, unfamiliar with that country, may not realize that authorities from time to time find empty boats adrift. It is not that uncommon, he said, especially after storms when they come untied. Not uncommon, which means the number of empty vessels found on American water every year is not small, and the number of them that anyone examines closely is a fraction of that, and the number that reach a newspaper is a fraction of the fraction. Everything you are hearing tonight is the residue at the top of a very deep pile. If you want the rest of that pile as it surfaces, subscribe, because this is now a recurring file on this channel rather than a one-off. Before the last of these, consider what an empty boat is actually able to prove. Because everything you have been building over the last hour rests on an assumption, and the assumption is wrong. When a vessel is found with nobody aboard, the reading that arrives automatically is that whoever was on it went into the water at that spot. That is why a search is launched where the boat is found, and why it expands outward from that point in a circle. But a boat underway is not a fixed object. It is a thing that keeps moving after the last decision made aboard it, and it keeps moving for as long as there is fuel or wind or current. A vessel with a motor running in gear will travel until it hits something, or runs dry. A vessel in neutral will drift with wind and surface current, and on a great lake that can be tens of miles in a night. A trolling motor holding a heading will hold it until the battery dies. So the location where a boat is found is not the location where anything happened. It is the location where the boat stopped, and the distance between those 2 points is unknown, unbounded, and different in every case. Tonight has given you the proof of that already. And it is the case I have been holding back. 2 more things about that before the proof arrives. The first is fuel. A recreational outboard at cruising throttle burns through a tank in a matter of hours, and a boat left in gear runs at whatever throttle setting the last hand on it left. So, a vessel found under power was found before the fuel ran out, which puts an upper bound on elapsed time and nothing else. A vessel found in neutral, or with the engine dead, gives you no bound at all. The second is wind. Every hull has a windage profile, which is the amount of surface standing above the water for the wind to push on. A cabin cruiser with a superstructure is a sail. A low, open skiff is not. 2 boats losing their crews in the same place on the same night end, up in completely different counties by morning. So the drift model, the search grid, and the aircraft tracks are all built on a number that is not knowable, and everybody involved understands this perfectly well, and there is nothing else to build them on. Jack Glaves was 58 years old, and he set off from a marina at Port Burwell on the Canadian shore of Lake Erie at about 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The weather that day was good. He was expected back that night and did not return, and the Rescue Coordination Center was notified just before 20 to midnight. A search began involving the Canadian and American Coast Guards, provincial police, the Air Force, a fire department, and an emergency service. Over the following days, they covered more than 5,000 square kilometers and searched for 53 hours by air and water. On Thursday morning, a passerby found his boat. A white 21-foot striper with a black canopy, sitting on a rocky stretch of shoreline in Madison Township, Ohio, the other side of Lake Erie. His boat crossed an international border and an entire Great Lake without him, and came to rest on a beach in another country. And the only reason anybody knows that is that a member of the public happened to walk past it. Look at the scale of what was spent before a passerby did it by accident. More than 5,000 square kilometers searched. 53 hours of air and water time. The Canadian and American Coast Guards, provincial police, an Air Force division, a Civil Air Search Association, a fire department, and an emergency medical service. All of that, working a probability area drawn around a marina on the North Shore, and the boat was on a rock beach in Ohio. He was later found in the lake. So hold that against every other case tonight. The Georgia sheriff calculated 90 minutes of running time before an 11-foot boat was found circling. The Coast Guard searched between Presque Isle and Long Point because that is where the 19-footer ended up, not because anybody knows where its owner was standing when it became empty. The search area in these cases is drawn around the wrong point, and everybody involved knows it, and there is no better option. One more layer to that, and it is administrative rather than physical. Search and rescue in American waters runs on a model that responds to tens of thousands of incidents a year across American waters, and it is very good at it. But a search is a resource decision made against a survival model. Planners calculate a survival time based on water temperature, air temperature, sea state, and what the person is likely wearing. And when the elapsed time exceeds that model by a sufficient margin, the search is suspended. None of that is indifference. It is arithmetic, and it exists because the alternative is searching forever with assets that are needed for people who are still alive. But it means something specific for the cases in tonight's file. In cold water, the survival window is measured in hours, and the search suspends in days. After that, the only people still looking are the family and volunteers and whoever happens to be on the water, which is exactly who found most of the boats in tonight's episode. And one more consequence, which is the reason so many families in these cases end up doing the work themselves. When a search is suspended, the case does not transfer to a detective in most jurisdictions. There is no homicide unit taking over because there is no evidence of a homicide. There is no missing persons investigator picking it up because the person is presumed drowned. The file goes into a category that has almost no owner, an unresolved marine incident with a presumed cause, which is how you end up with a Michigan case sitting in a missing persons drawer with a knob embedded in a shoe, and a Virgin Islands case in which the vessel was never searched, and a Florida case where the manner of death is undetermined and has been for a decade. Nobody closed any of those. They simply reached the end of the process that was pointed at them. Which brings me to the one case tonight that broke every assumption in this episode, including mine. Green Lake, Wisconsin, the 12th of August, 2024. A 45-year-old married father of 3 named Ryan Borgwart left home with a kayak to go fishing and did not come back. Search teams found his capsized kayak floating on Green Lake, along with a life jacket. Green Lake is deep, over 200 feet at its deepest point, which is unusual for that part of the country. His van and trailer were parked at a launch nearby. Over the following days, searchers recovered his fishing rod and a tackle box with his keys, his wallet, and his license inside it. Every single element of an accidental drowning was present. The capsized boat, the floating life jacket, the vehicle at the ramp, the personal effects in the water. The sheriff's office searched for 54 days. A volunteer recovery organization founded by a man whose own brother drowned on a canoe trip put 28 days into that lake alone with sonar. He has spent over 30 years doing public safety diving, and he said afterwards that failing to find Borgwart had him questioning his own competence and costing him sleep. Green Lake deserves a note because the depth is why the story held for as long as it did. It is the deepest natural inland lake in Wisconsin, past 230 feet in places, which in a state of shallow glacial lakes is an anomaly. Deep cold fresh water is the single hardest environment in which to recover a body, for the reason we touched on earlier. The bacterial process that produces the gas that lifts a body to the surface effectively stops in cold water at depth. So when a kayak turns up capsized on Green Lake and a man does not, every professional involved has a ready-made explanation for why he is not coming up, and the explanation is correct in every other case they have worked. That is what made it perfect. They never found him because he was not in the lake. Investigators went into his laptop. They found searches about moving funds to foreign banks. They found a life insurance policy for $370,000 taken out in January of that year. They found a history of messages with a woman in Uzbekistan. Officials concluded he had staged the entire scene and traveled to Europe, and the sheriff stood at a press conference and spoke to him directly, asking him to contact his family. And notice what it cost, because this is the part nobody discusses when the story gets told as a piece of true crime entertainment. 54 days of a sheriff's office. 28 days of one volunteer diver's life. On one lake for one man. State Conservation Resources, a nonprofit founded in the memory of somebody else's drowned brother, spending its capacity and its equipment on a scene that had been arranged. And a wife and 3 children who spent months believing their husband and father had drowned in front of them, in a lake they can see, and then found out otherwise from a press conference. The sheriff ended that briefing by speaking directly to the missing man and asking him to contact his family. He said they understood that things happen, but that there was a family who wanted their father back. There is also an ugly secondary effect that the Wisconsin case produced and that nobody has measured. Every sheriff in America who works a lake now has that case in the back of his mind. The next time a capsized kayak and a floating life jacket turn up with a van at the ramp, somebody in that room is going to say the words out loud, and they are going to be said in front of a family. That is not a reason to withhold the case. It happened. It is documented. And the reason it matters is precisely that it is real. But it is worth knowing what it costs, because in 14 of the 15 files tonight, there is a family who is going to be asked at some point by somebody with a badge or a camera whether their husband or their son might have arranged the whole thing. Now think about what that case does to the 14 others. An overturned kayak, a floating life jacket, a vehicle at the ramp, and a wallet in the water is the most complete picture of an accidental drowning that a lake can produce. And in that case, every part of it was placed there deliberately by a man who was still alive. Which means, an empty boat proves that a boat is empty. It does not prove a drowning. It does not prove a fall. It does not prove an accident. And it does not prove a crime. It is an object with no memory, found somewhere downstream of an event nobody witnessed, and the story we hang on it is supplied entirely by us. And there is a limit to how far that can be pushed. A version of this channel would take the Wisconsin case and use it to imply the others are staged, and that would be a lie by structure rather than by statement. 14 of these are not that. 14 of them involve people whose lives contained no insurance policy, taken out in January, no messages to a stranger overseas, no searches about foreign banks. Most of them involve people whose families are still on the water at weekends looking. The point of Green Lake is narrower and harder. It is that the physical scene, on its own, carried no information. Everything a lake can present as proof of a drowning was present, and it was wrong. And it took a laptop rather than a lake to establish that. So in every one of the other 14, the physical scene is carrying just as little. Every version you have constructed tonight is one you built yourself, out of a hull and a running motor and a bit of music. So was mine. If you have ever been on a lake and seen something out there that did not make sense, put it in the comments. I read them. More than one episode of this channel has started with a line somebody typed under a video. One last case, and it is the only one tonight where the boat came back and told them something. The 22nd of September, 2007. A 47-foot sport fisher called the Joe Cool left the Miami Beach Marina for the island of Bimini, 60 miles away. 4 crew and 2 passengers. 3 days later, the Coast Guard found her doing circles and dragging her anchor in a lonely stretch of the Florida Straits, about 30 miles north of Cuba. No crew, no passengers. A cutter towed her back into Biscayne Bay, and along the docks of one of the wealthiest marinas in America, Men stopped buffing holes and stood still and watched a white boat come up the channel with nobody on it. One woman who was there described it afterwards as a ghostly feeling and said that as the boat passed, there was only emptiness. A sport fisher of that size is a serious vessel. 47 feet, twin diesels, a flying bridge, a fighting chair. The kind of boat that costs more than most houses and is crewed rather than driven. The run to Bimini and back is a standard charter, 60 miles each way across the Gulf Stream, and a professional crew does it without thinking about it. 6 people went out on her. 4 of them worked aboard. Forensics went aboard. This time, the vessel was not silent. They recovered 4 9mm shell casings, a small key that might or might not have opened a set of handcuffs, and splotches of human blood inside the cabin and outside it. 12 miles north of where the ghost boat had been found, drifting in an orange life raft, were the 2 men who had chartered her. That case went to court, and it is not a mystery. I am including it for one reason, and it is the reason it belongs at the end rather than the beginning. The Joe Cool is what an empty boat looks like when it has something to say. Casings, blood, a key, a raft 12 miles off with 2 men in it. Now go back through everything else tonight and count how much of that any of the other vessels produced. The Sea's Life had a radio playing and money in the wallet. The Catamaran in the Virgin Islands had a phone and a passport and was never searched. The Sun Dolphin had a birthday cookie. The Stump Knocker had no blood at all, which is precisely the problem, and later acquired red paint nobody can source. The Kayak at Bonita Beach had documents in it. The Catalina in Puget Sound had 7 people on it and produced not one floating object in 6 days of searching. 14 boats came back carrying nothing that could establish an event. 1 came back carrying casings and blood, and that one is closed. One more comparison is worth making before I stop, and it is between the 2 Florida cases at either end of tonight. The Joe Cool was a 47-foot vessel with 6 people aboard, and she came back carrying shell casings, blood inside and outside the cabin, and a small key. Within days, there were 2 men in custody who had been found in a life raft, and eventually there was a courtroom. Patrick Mullins was on a small open skiff, alone, and his boat came back carrying nothing at all. No blood, no weapon, just a hull that had arrived in Tampa Bay without him, by a route nobody has ever established. Same state, same water system more or less. One boat spoke and one did not. And the one that did not is the one where a man was found bound to an anchor. None of that is a coincidence anybody can build a theory on. But it is the clearest illustration in tonight's file of what decides whether a family gets an answer, and severity has nothing to do with it. It is whether the boat happened to keep any of it. And that is the shape of this whole file. The vessels that carry evidence get solved. The vessels that carry nothing become the cases you have just spent an hour on. And no third category exists. There is no boat in this episode that came back with a partial answer, or a hint, or a direction. It is either a scene, or it is a hull and a running engine and silence. One category of question has been circling this episode, and it deserves stating plainly before the close, because it is the reason these cases behave differently from any other kind of disappearance. In almost every other missing persons case, the last known position is a place a person chose to be. A house, a car park, a trailhead, a road. On the water, it is a moving object, which means the fundamental unit of a boating disappearance is not a location. It is a vector, a hull, a heading, a speed, and a duration, none of which anybody knows, multiplied by a person drifting on a completely different vector at a completely different rate. Everything downstream of that is guesswork wearing the clothing of procedure. The search grid is real, the aircraft are real, the drift model is real mathematics done by serious people, and the input is a position that means nothing. That is why every hull in tonight's file came back, and most of the people on them did not. And it is why the few who did come back arrived 7 miles away, or 9 days later, or on a beach in another country. One more thing before the end, and it is the only judgment I will make tonight. Go back through the 15 and notice how many of them involve somebody who was good at this. The daughter of a Coast Guard officer, trained by her father, described by everyone who knew her as the most safety-conscious boater they had met. A professional chef living aboard a working charter catamaran. A man who had fished the same river for years and could rebuild an engine. A fisherman who had run the same coast his whole working life. A 50-year-old coach and a college professor on a lake half an hour from a lodge. These are not people who wandered onto the water by accident. The public story about boating deaths is a story about inexperience. No life jacket, too much drink, too much speed, a small boat too far out. That story is true often enough to be worth telling, and it is not tonight's. Tonight's file is about competent people on vessels they knew, in conditions that were mostly fine, doing something they had done before. And the last thing worth saying is about the word this whole episode has been circling. Every one of these cases produced a search, and every search produced a decision to stop. That decision is made against a survival model, in cold water measured in hours, and it is the correct decision made by people who do this for a living. But a second thing stops when a search stops, and it is that the looking. It is the question. Once a case is suspended, an empty boat becomes a boating accident in the public record. Whatever its condition, whatever was found aboard, whatever the family says, it becomes a line in a statistic about recreational vessel fatalities. And the specific facts, the running motor, the playing radio, the piece of hardware in the sole of a shoe, the red paint that appeared on a hull in police custody, stop being investigative material and become trivia. That is how a case with a knob embedded in a running shoe ends up in a missing persons drawer. Not because anybody decided it was ordinary, because the machinery for deciding otherwise ran out of hours. Here is where I leave you. Let me put the 15 on the table, and then I am finished. 3 of them were found under power, still running, with nobody at the controls. An 11-foot boat circling a Georgia lake, a 19-footer on Lake Erie with the trolling motor going, and a runaway on a Wisconsin reservation. 3 of them were found with sound still coming out of them. And that is the detail. Nothing in this episode can file anywhere useful. A radio on Lake Huron, music on Lake Washington, and a cabin cruiser and a speedboat that both had somebody's evening still playing to an empty deck. 2 of them traveled a distance that makes the search area meaningless. One crossed an entire Great Lake and an international border and beached in another country. One arrived in Tampa Bay from a small tidal river, and nobody has ever been able to say how. One of them had never had anybody in the water at all, and one of them, in 1971, took 7 people off a marina dock in a 22-foot sailboat and produced, across 6 days of one of the largest maritime searches in the history of an inland sea, not a single floating object. Count the people who have never been recovered at all. Not a body, not a partial recovery, nothing. A lawyer from Lake Huron, 20 years gone. A woman from a catamaran in the Caribbean. A coach from a Georgia lake. 7 students from a marina in Tacoma. A kayaker in a life jacket from a lake you can stand up in. A 77-year-old from the Gulf of Mexico. And whoever was aboard 4 vessels whose names never reached a newspaper. That is more than a dozen human beings from 15 boats. And the total is only that low, because in 4 of those cases, nobody ever established how many people were on board to begin with. 2 came back at a distance that raised more questions than it settled. A woman 7 miles from her boat, and a man 9 days later bound to an anchor. One came back on the far shore of a lake he had not crossed alive. One turned out to be in Europe, 15 hulls, 2 answers between them, and one of those answers was a man in Europe, and a running tally of the word I asked you to count at the beginning. A Michigan detective asked 3 separate questions about what he found on a boat in the middle of a Great Lake, answering all 3 with nothing. A Coast Guard statement about Lake Erie, saying they do not know what happened to the man on board. a Virgin Islands police force unable to confirm whether a woman was ever aboard. A Tacoma detective describing a case with no starting point at all. 4 different agencies, 5 decades apart, all reaching for the same word. Somewhere on the water tonight, there is a boat with nobody on it. Not a famous one. Not one that will ever have a name you recognize. A sheriff in Georgia told a reporter that finding empty boats adrift is not that uncommon. And he was not being callous, he was being accurate. And that sentence is the most disturbing thing anybody said out loud in the research for this episode. Not that uncommon. The engine will run until the fuel is gone. The music will play until the battery dies. And the hull will keep traveling. Across a bay, across a lake, across an international border, and up onto a beach in another country, carrying the last few minutes of somebody's life at 4 knots in whatever direction the wind decides. And nobody will know when it emptied. That is the sentence I keep coming back to after 2 months in these files. Not where, not why, when. Because every search that follows an empty boat is drawn around a moment that nobody can locate. And the difference between the right moment and the wrong one is the difference between finding somebody in the first hour and never finding them at all. The hull knows. It is the only witness in every one of these cases, and it is made of fiberglass. Somebody will find it eventually. A passerby on a rocky shore, a ferry captain with a spotlight, a caller who dials 911 because something is circling out there and nobody is in it. And then a search will begin, in a circle drawn around a point that means nothing at all.